I'm Roby Price, and welcome to my workshop.
Well, I'm just back from the hardware store. Got some odds and ends. We loaded up the lumber yesterday, so it's already in the shop. We're going to be doing some work back in the study. We've got some trim work, some recessed panels, maybe a few other things going on. Come on inside, let me show you what we've got.
Office space. Time for recess.
This is the lumber we moved in the other day, and it is quite large. I've got over 12 inches on this board, and we are trying to duplicate shapes like these. This is going to be what we use for trim and a little bit larger for face frames. Now, I have an example of this recessed panel I was talking about. It's in the study. Follow me and I'll show you what it looks like. Well, here's a better look at our end panels. This is a 3/4 inch system for the rails and stiles. The field is 1/4 inch and it's inset a 1/4 inch inside the frame. Now the difference in that measure is made up in the moldings, and the moldings have a good size rabbet in that, so everything levels out real nice. You'll see a little bit more about that here in a minute. Now I've got 3 of these panels, one here, but the end of this row butts into a wall, so I don't need another one there. I have another set of cabinets behind you, and I've got 2 there. Those are already made. We're focusing on the lower ones today, and I have 4 of those to make. They're not going to be as complicated because these are so tall I needed 2 recesses. On the bottom, it's going to be a single, but we've got a lot of plywood to cut up. We've got to stitch that together with pocket hole screws, and then we make our own moldings. This is a specialty knife that I had made for this particular project. So nothing happens out here. Let's get in the shop. Let's get busy.
We're going to start with the frames, and that means 3/4 inch plywood. We'll use the track saw to get our general widths. Then it's to the crosscut saw to get our general lengths.
Well, I'm all roughed out, and it's time to go ahead and put the final edge on these. I've got 4.5 inches here, so 2 cuts, and I'm totally parallel, and I've got the accuracy of the rip fence to make sure everything is just right. I know I said I wasn't going to do a center style, and I changed my mind after I sketched it up. I am going to do a center style, and if my overall panel is 30 inches tall, this needs to be 21. I have 4 on top and 5 on the bottom. But I don't want it to be 30 inches. I want it to be 30.5. So that's where this dimension is critical. I've already got everything cut to width. So now the height of the panel is now going to be dependent on the height of the center stile. So we've got to start paying attention to these length dimensions right off the bat. We'll cut these at 21.5. All the lower cabinets are a very consistent 23 inches deep, but that is not what we're going to make these top and lower rails to, because the wall and the slab are not a perfect 90 degrees. So we have a little offset in these cabinets, as much as 1/2 inch. We're going to make each one of these 1/2 inch larger. That makes the whole panel 23.5 inches, and then you scribe the panel to the wall to get a very tight fit. That way nobody knows.
When cutting panels like this, I really like to gang them up. Now you can't see it, but there's a clamp in the background. That makes sure that everything is held tight and nothing moves. We'll flip this around and cut the other side, and then all 4 are going to be the same length.
All our rails and stiles are cut to length and width. It's time to start thinking about assembly. The first step is how we're going to put it together. We're going to use pocket hole screws. Second, what is the order of assembly? You always start from the inside and work out. That alleviates any fit-up problems. Now, this is the center stile. It is as center as you can get. And you might think I would just plug this in here and start drilling out pocket holes. That's not the case. This is a small area right here. So I would prefer to take out material from a larger piece. That helps maintain stability. This is the bottom rail, and this is the much bigger of the two pieces. So this is where we'll start drilling. Second, let's look at it. I've got really good surface right here, and I've got sharp edges. This is a good face forward. Second, I have a very frayed edge here with the veneer. That happens sometimes on a crosscut saw. It happens on a table saw. So look at your piece, put your best face forward. So I've labeled this back and I've labeled this side up. So we'll go ahead and put him in here. Now I have just put in this stop right here for this series of setups so that I'm in the right place all the time. With this little bit of prep, you can start moving through this process pretty quickly. I do this because I'm on my bottom rails right now, and my rails are actually thicker than my stiles. So having lined up with this, I will now line up with the other side, and that'll be my measure. And that gives me a lot of moment capacity right there.
The clamp and the blue plate that is inset into the bench are a kit. They come together, and they're specifically designed to help assembly of pocket hole connections. It holds it tight to the bench and doesn't allow any vertical or horizontal movement while you set your screws. Now that all the center stiles are in place and centered, we really don't need the jig helping us to line out a 90-degree angle. All we need is that hold down clamp, and everything else can be lined up by touch.
Well, now that our panels are assembled, I have taken them into the study and I have scribed some lines on there. And this is to scribe them against the wall so we get a nice tight fit. Now that line is marked over here. What I've got here is I've got one of the panels, and the rip fence is set such that it just barely grazes the blade. But the top panel is offset by the scribe, and it's held onto the bottom panel with my track saw clamps, very narrow, and they're narrow enough to fit in the miter slot. So this is the technique that I'm going to use to get my tapered cut. We could have used a tapering jig, but you know, I've got so much hanging out here that I think that this might actually be more stable.
You probably noticed that the two side stiles run long. That's intentional. If the center stile had been a touch short, I could have recovered from that because the stiles on the outside were intentionally long. This is just a practice that I've adopted over the years. We'll sand all the panels down to 220 grit.
Well, the work on the 3/4 inch plywood is just about done. These panels all came out pretty nice. Everything's nice and square and scribed. But it's time to start looking at the insides. This is a recessed panel, so we're looking at thinner stock, and that's what's behind me. This is 1/4 inch plywood. This is leftover material. I try not to throw anything out. This is leftover stock from the backs of all the existing cabinets. Don't be too quick to go to the burn pit. It's looking like about 21 inches by 7.5, and that makes it 15. It looks like we can get the whole thing out of that stock.
Time has not been kind to this plywood. It was stored correctly, but it has warped. Fortunately, my recesses are small, so any deflection is going to be minimized by the size of the recess. Don't forget to sand it down. We'll take it to 220 grit, and I promise you it'd be much more difficult to sand this down after it's assembled.
Well, it's time to start thinking about the moldings, and I have a spare stick right here that I made up for the top panels. It's about 1.5 inches wide, and that's what I need. The thickness, it's not as important. I need thickness, mind you. I need about 3/4 plus, but I'm going to get that out of this stock. What is also critical is the length. I have 2 vertical runs that I need to have enough material to get to, and if I cut this in half and make it easier to deal with, that gives me 65 inches. I've got 25-inch vertical run, and that allows me to have 2 vertical runs out of a single stick once I subdivide it. Now, I also have to cut it in half this way. I only have an 8-inch jointer, and this board is way too wide for that. So we've got some preliminary cuts to make before we can even start dimensioning up this lumber.
At this point, I've already cut this board in half to make both sides easier to manage. I've also put a straight edge on it with the jointer. It's not square, but it is straight. You really don't want to rip a board on a table saw unless one edge is straight. Variations in thickness as it rides against the fence can pinch the blade, and that can cause a kickback. Take the time and get one edge straight. It's a safer cut that way. All our stock is a little over 6 inches wide. The next step is to face joint one side. Then we go to the planer. That makes both faces parallel and to a specific thickness. And note that the only thing I really care about is being about 3/4 of an inch. This is not something that I fussed with too much. I just wanted to make sure that I got both sides parallel. Now we'll go to the jointer. I want a square edge on both sides indexed against the faces. Note that I put 2 marks on there, one at each corner. That allows me to take off just a little bit, and I'll know when both corners are square. It's time to rip our trim stock to width. I'm set at just a hair above 1.5 inches. Even with feed rollers and a good fence and a good blade, you're not going to be perfectly straight coming off the table saw. You might actually have a little burn. So I always go back to the jointer to clean up that edge before I make my next cut. So we'll go back and forth between the jointer and the table saw until all of our molding strips are cut. It seems like belt and suspenders, but then I'll take it to the drum sander, and I will go ahead and gang them all together to make sure everything is uniform before we go to the shaper molder.
Well, all of our square stock for the molding is machined up and dimensioned. It's all ready to go. And I have a piece that I have tried out right here, and it looks pretty good. This is the same setup that I used when I did the top panels for the upper shelves. All the settings are in place. I don't want to change them. I'm going to show you this machine after I've run all my sticks through and break it down. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and run these. And you'll notice that I don't have the recess cut in here. I'm going to do that with the dado blade on the table saw.
There's really not a whole lot to see here. The tool just feeds it in and puts the molding profile on it. But in case you were wondering who makes the tool, I will put that in the show notes.
So this is our cutter head. Notice that it's grooved right here. There are counter grooves, and it's hard to see on the other side over here. And it's also held in place by this, which is a wedge, which actually wedges it in tight. It is not going anywhere. To give you an idea of the profile, there you can see that a little bit better right there. And note that when this thing spins around, this has weight and mass, so we are counterbalanced on the other side here. Similar mechanism. This is grooved here, and a wedge comes up, and with this Allen screw right there, it holds it in place very tight. My moldings came out great. I really like these. And I've also cut the first rabbet in here. This is going to sit on top of the plywood frame. The recessed panel comes over here. It's going to be a really good look. And this is the setup I have. I'm pushing my piece through. This crown right here is right in between these 2 wheels. It keeps it nice and tight against the fence. But I have part of the blade exposed over there, and this is going to be pretty tight and pretty close to the blade, and I don't need that. So I'm going to turn this whole thing around and come at it this way. I'm going to use a sacrificial fence over here, bury the blade completely. It gets my push stick farther away from the work, and I think it's going to produce a safer, nicer cut. I've got the first of my moldings cut, and I want to go ahead and place it in this section right here to make sure it's the right size, and it is. The next step of the process is to figure out how much I can get out of my moldings. This piece came out of here, and when I put it in place, notice this one's cut at a 45 here. My tips are on this side. So I'll take my piece and place it here. I made a mark right here to denote the length. I come over here I do it again. I can get 3 of the long pieces out of this stick of molding. I'm going to take this to the cross-cut saw, and we're just going to go ahead and cross-cut it. The reason for that is I'm going to make these angle cuts with a jig so that I know they're right. But I'm only going to do that after I get the lengths cut. The short lengths right here, we'll use what's left over for that, but the method is going to be the same.
I'll use a stop for the straight cuts. That helps me ensure that all the lengths are correct. The first miter cut is simple. I just have to eyeball it. All that's really necessary is that I get pretty close to the end of the board. Having cut all the miters on my first lengths, I'll go ahead and set up a stop and we'll cut the second miter.
Well, you might have thought I was going to take my frames, just put them in here, and try to get them to sit on this tiny little rabbet. It is small. These things will just fall in. They will not stay put. And this is an exercise in futility. Additionally, if I use any glue on this, the glue is going to get everywhere. So there is a better way to do this. These are framing jigs, and they work fantastic. And they're very inexpensive. I would encourage you to go out and look for some. As a matter of fact, when I found them, I bought 2. They were that inexpensive, and they work. They're self-centering. I've got 1 bolt right here that pulls them together. The arms come in, these things move, these corner blocks move, and everything centers up and everything gets square. Now, I've got these set up. This is just the setup. I'll loosen this bolt, open them up a little bit, put just a touch of glue on the ends, put them all back in place, and tighten them up. I'll let them sit for a little while, but I'm going to secure these corners with pin nails. Then I'll let them dry for a bit. We'll lay them in our frames, and it will look great.
I'll put a touch of glue on the ends of both short pieces. Sometimes a finger does a better job than anything else for spreading glue. Just keep a paper towel handy. We'll put our pieces in the jig and hand tighten. We'll visibly check all of our joints, and a little bit of wiggling will help everything seat in place correctly. At this point, we're ready for the wrench. Give it a little bit of tight. You should see some glue squeeze out in the mitered corners. I'll give the glue about 5 minutes, but then I follow up with the pin nailer. You can use a brad nailer for this, but it leaves a much larger hole at the nail head. Also, you can do nothing. The glue, if it's given time to set, will be strong enough for the next couple of steps.
Well, all my frames are done, and I have taken the time to put them into the panels. This was for 2 reasons. 1, give the glue a chance to dry in a place that I knew would be level. And 2, gets them all out of the way and in one place. It's time to put the recess in the recess panel. And I don't want to glue these in place and nail them in. I want to put the panel on top. To do that, I'm going to turn the frames over gently. Put them in place. They'll sit. Take my panel. This is the sanded side. We'll put that right there. Now you'll note that there is just maybe a 1/16 of an inch around the whole bit, and that's the difference. I'll take my pin nailer and shoot it in. Note, I've taken a little time. I have looked at the depth that I have in my moldings and the depth I have in my panels. I should be able to come in just 1/4 of an inch, shoot my pins, and not come through.
Put a bead of glue down on the moldings. You don't need much. As a matter of fact, you don't want much. You don't want that glue to spread out past the edge of the moldings. We'll go ahead and set it in place, finger tight, making sure that we've got a reveal around all 4 sides. The pin nails go in, and I focus on the corners first in order to make sure that I don't get any movement after the fact. The only trick is to stay about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch inside the outside edges. That way, you don't shoot through.
Our panels are setting up, and they need to get a little bit tacky before we go to the next step. So we're going to finish up the last of the woodworking right now, which is actually cutting some spacers. Recall that the cabinets are made of 3/4 inch plywood. Our end panels are also 3/4 of an inch plywood. In between each one of our cabinets, we add a 1/2 inch material to make a 2-inch wide face frame strip. And we need that because we had to have something to mount the doors on. Now, on our end panels, we want that same 2 inches. So I've been searching for the perfect piece of wood, and this is it. It is really ugly. It is warped, can't take a finish, but it is a 1/2 inch thick. And if we cut this into thin strips, it will be the perfect spacer. I have my panel that's going to be mounted here on the end of this cabinet. Now I have pre-drilled holes for all the screws that are going to mount this panel to this cabinet. These are the spacers. Now that these holes are drilled from the other side, all I have to do is place them, and 2 1-inch brads are all I need to hold this in place. When the screw goes through, they won't go anywhere.
It's time to revisit these panels. The glue has had a chance to set, so we can do this without worry. I'm going to put a bead of glue in the rabbet for the moldings. That's what's going to sit against the plywood frame. We'll use a finger to make sure that the glue surface is uniform. After that, we'll flip over both panels and put them in place. We'll check both panels for square both with each other and with the top edge and side of the panels. Note that one side is scribed. Use the square edge to do that, otherwise it won't be right.
Got my panel in place, my spacers, making sure things are leveled out the way they're supposed to be. It's time to put in a screw. Now, this is my choice, primarily because even if it's countersunk, it doesn't go in. This is supposed to be 2 inches. A 2-inch screw would have gone all the way through with the countersink. Make sure you measure these things. Well, it's getting a little late in the day, but we finished. All 4 panels are in, and they look great. I love a recessed panel. It puts a really nice coat of polish on an otherwise flat panel. It really does set things off. Additionally, the scribes came out perfect, and that hides a lot of sins. When the walls and the slab aren't quite square, getting a good scribe line in there, you can't tell. And right now, it looks like everything is just flush. Now, that wraps things up for this episode, and it allows us to walk into the next one, which is face frames. I've got these panels in place now, and I can start that project. That's what all that lumber out there in the sawhorses is for. So I hope you'll join me next time in Roby's workshop.